So this final section is about the connection between explanation and simplification. And this is really important for thinking about neuroscience because the human brain is arguably the most complicated thing that scientists have ever tried to explain. Now, as I've talked about models so far in this lecture, I've imagined that or presented it as if the models are just capturing everything which is there in nature to the best knowledge of the scientists who are making these models. But it's really important to recognize that models themselves have to make simplifications, especially given how complicated things are in the systems which they're trying to represent. Given that the brain is so complicated, we couldn't expect that models will help scientists understand the brain if they just transfer all of that complexity into the scientists' models. You need to strip away some of that complexity in order for models to give explanations which actually help scientists to understand what's going on in nature. So all scientific models are simplifications in some way. If you think about maps of a city or any region of geography, they can't include all of the details of what's there in the territory, or else they wouldn't be useful. They're only useful in virtue of abstracting away from a lot of the detail that's there in the world. And that's just as much the case with scientific models. There's always more in nature than you could or would want to put in a scientific representation like a model. Alongside abstraction, there's this thing known as idealization. This is where scientists deliberately represent the world in ways that are known to be not true of how things are in nature. So there's an old joke about a physicist asked to help out on a dairy farm, and in order to theorize how cows function, he tells the farmer, well, we have to assume that cows are spherical and they float in a vacuum. Well, of course, that's not how cows are, but in models and physics, often things are described in equally unrealistic ways. There's the idealization of point particles and frictionless planes. These are things that couldn't happen as physical systems, and yet it's useful when modeling them, modeling real concrete physical systems, to depict them in ways that are blatantly unrealistic. It's important to remember that abstraction and idealization are pervasive in neuroscientific models, and remember that old saying that the map is not the territory. So the question is, how far away from the actual workings of the brain are our neuroscientific models? So how I like to think about this is that the models that provide understanding are a compromise between the mind-boggling complexity of the brain and our capacity as human beings to grasp a network of relations. So even if you take a really small nervous system, like the nervous system of the little worm C. elegans that has about 300 neurons, you can see in this network map on the left here that there's a set of interactions that is really hard just looking at it to make sense of. You wouldn't be able to learn much about the operation of C. elegans' nervous system just by looking at that map and trying to figure out how all the different parts relate to one another. Scientists are limited like all other human beings, and they have to sort of focus in on certain sets of relationships and ignore the rest of what's going on in order to get more of a grasp in detail about how some parts of their systems are working together. So you can think of the information overload that you get when any graphs or maps get too complicated. You can't think in more than 3 dimensions, can't visualize more than 3 dimensions. What you want from your scientific representations is just the essential information that you need in order to solve the particular tasks that you have at hand. It's worth thinking now about what makes something complex. And I'm going to spend the next few slides talking about the different ways that the brain is complicated in terms of the number of its parts, how different each of the parts are, how those parts change in time, how they interact with one another, and how their behavior changes depending on what's going on in the brain around it. So just in terms of number of components, the human brain is impressive. There's estimated to be around 80 billion neurons in the cortex of an adult. But neurons in the cortex aren't the only cells in the brain. There's actually more neurons in this structure called the cerebellum, which gets less attention in cognitive neuroscience, but it has tons of neurons in there. And there's also a huge population of glial cells in the brain. So these are not electrically excitable, they're not involved in the action potential firings, but yet they are thought to be involved with cognition, and yet they're normally neglected. So most neuroscientific models ignore an awful lot of the brain cells which are there, even in any particular region of the brain, and just focus in on a handful of neurons thought to be particularly important for a given cognitive process. This slide is just showing you an electron micrograph of human brain cells. And just to show you how densely packed they are, they kind of look like this tangled forest. It was just hours and hours of work to get an image like this, with all of these different neurons, fibers actually shown in different colors in order to represent where one neuron ends and the other one begins. That's a lot of work just figuring that out because the fibers are so densely interconnected. And one thing you'll notice is that the shapes are really different from one another. So they really are like a forest, in that no two trees in a forest are identical with one another. Similarly with brain cells, they all grow a bit differently and have different shaped branches and so forth. So in neuroscience textbooks, you'll see, if you like, taxonomies of different classes of neurons, which have different typical shapes. You could think of them as like different pictures of species of trees that you might get in a forestry book, and yet each individual neuron will be different from one another. And then you also have these differences across, if you like, species of different kinds of neurons. So there's an awful lot of heterogeneity of components. But for many purposes, both in teaching and research, neuroscientists ignore this heterogeneity and just think of generic textbook neurons like this one, which has these dendrites and these axon terminals in no particular arrangement. And yet, when people think about some of the reasons why you have these differences in shapes of neurons, they are thought to be functionally important in many cases. But then we don't always feel the need to communicate those details or even pay attention to those details. We can also think about how the components of the brain change across time. So as I mentioned before, the regulation of the strength of synapses, known as long-term depression and long-term potentiation, is an important part of the story of memory formation. This is an indication, actually, that the brain is a dynamical thing. It's changing its structures and its connections all of the time in order to do what it does and form memories and be involved with adaptation and learning. So that's a really obvious way in which there must be change across time in terms of synaptic plasticity. But actually, if you just look at neuronal membranes themselves, so the cell walls that bound each neuron, that itself is a dynamical structure. Those cross-channel proteins, which I talked about with the ion pump example, in that picture I showed you before, it looked like they were just static objects which do no more than open and close, but otherwise are fixed features of the cells. Actually, the proteins themselves sort of come in and out of existence fairly regularly, which is a strange thing to think about. But the cell wall of any neuron is building itself and rebuilding itself across time. So even the structures of the neurons themselves are quite dynamic objects. One of the ways that the brain is so able to do what it does in terms of learning and memory and control of behavior is because the neurons are talking to one another so frequently and in such a complicated way. So, in other words, it's really significant to how the brain works that there's this great density of interactions between the components. The standard estimate is that in the cortex there are 10,000 of connections per neuron with other neurons. So that's an awful lot of interaction. And it means that there are about trillions of synapses per brain. So because of all this interactivity, it means that there's a lot of context dependency in the behavior of the components of the brain. On the left here, you have a diagram of the large white matter tracts which are there in the human brain. So linking one hemisphere to the other hemisphere, the left and right halves of the brain, and also from the back to front of the brain, you'll see the connections going forward there. What this means, because of these connections, is that what's going on in one side of your brain can really make an impact on what's going on the other side of the brain. This allows your behavior to be coordinated and cohesive, but it also adds a lot of complexity because the behavior of any one part of the brain is really dependent on what's going on in the rest of the brain at any given time. And another form of context dependency comes from this phenomenon known as neuromodulation. So as well as neurotransmitters, these chemicals involved in signaling from one neuron to another at the synapse, these chemical neuromodulators are released in a more diffused way, affecting the behavior of populations of neurons at one time. And this is sort of highly regulated and important in cognition and mental health and all kinds of things in ways that people are only scratching the surface of. What we can conclude here is that mechanistic models are mappings and they're not the territory. Something like this textbook diagram of a sodium-potassium pump is clearly disregarding the amount of dynamicism and context dependency which is really going on in those processes in the neuron. It's a good way to depict the essential information that's relevant to teaching people the basics of neuroexcitation and for most research purposes. But we shouldn't think that this is all there is that's going on with that object in the brain. And likewise, we need to remember that computational models are highly idealized. So computational neurons, the kinds of neurons that figure now in artificial neural network models of the brain and deep learning, they're almost like the spherical cows of neuroscience. These computational models of neurons do not have any of the anatomical structure that are there in real neurons. And yet these models have been transformative for AI recently, which is a really interesting thing, that even when models of biological systems are highly idealized and abstract away from most of the complexity which is there in nature, they can still do amazing things in engineering terms. So given the importance of computational models in neuroscience, you might have been wondering, is the brain a computer? What I argue in my own research is that the attraction of computational models of cognition is that they provide a simple lens through which to view these very complex neural processes. As I just said, the artificial neural network models of the brain are massive simplifications of what's really going on in these neural systems. So they're, if you like, latching onto some processes, but disregarding many others. So this leads me to think that the claim that the brain is a computer is another way to confuse the map with the territory. The computational models, thinking about the brain in terms of these artificial systems, which are much simpler than biological systems, is this handy abstraction, but we shouldn't confuse the model with the real thing. So just to summarize what I've talked about so far, we've looked at the reasons for people that are being invested in scientific explanation. Some of it is curiosity driven, but there's also the more practical ambitions of predicting things that happen in nature and also trying to find ways to control those processes. I also talked about different kinds of explanatory questions, how questions which give you the causal basis for certain processes that happen, and why questions which give you the functional reasons why certain structures and processes would have evolved in biology. So by understanding why a certain process in a system would be adaptive, then you have ultimately an evolutionary explanation of why certain structures would be there. So mechanistic explanations are more linked to that causal how kind of account, and I've argued that computational models are importantly different and they fit more into the line of answering why questions about the function and ultimately the evolutionary reasons why certain systems would be there. And finally, I talked about abstraction and idealization and about how scientific understanding requires simplification and how that means that we shouldn't interpret all of these models as just literally showing us exactly how things are in the brain. And finally, here are some suggested readings. I've listed Bill Bechtel's book, which is a really nice introduction for textbook level for the whole topic of neural mechanisms. For my own argument about why computational models are different from mechanistic models, I can refer you to this paper from 2014. Carl Craver's book from 2007, Explaining the Brain, is a really nice manifesto of the approach of mechanistic explanation, whereas Francis Egan talks about the differences between computational explanation and mechanistic explanation, giving the case study including David Marr's work, which I touched upon here. David Kaplan gives you a mechanistic account of computational explanation, and I also want to mention Angela Potocznik's book, which is about the whole topic of idealization in science and how that's important to scientific understanding. And finally, Dan Weisskopf's article about psychological explanation, just so that we don't forget that psychology and connecting psychology with neuroscience is a really important part of why people are interested in explaining the brain. Thank you.